What if some of the most powerful voices in gospel history were not celebrated by the church, but quietly pushed out of it? These were singers who filled sanctuaries, moved congregations to tears, and wrote songs that still echo in pews today. But behind the harmony and hallelujah was a side of gospel music the church never advertised. Careers were blacklisted without press releases. Artists were shunned without public announcements. Doors simply stopped opening, and nobody was supposed to ask why. Some were punished for crossing into secular music. Some were removed for who they loved. Others were silenced for saying things the institution was not ready to hear. These are 20 gospel legends the church quietly banned and why nobody talked about it. 20. Wynona Carr. Before Wynona Carr ever recorded a secular note, she was one of gospel's most commanding voices. She sang with a raw, blues-drenched delivery that shook the foundations of whatever church she entered, and gospel audiences across the Midwest knew her name long before the mainstream did. Her connection to the church ran deep, shaped by years of ministry work and the kind of vocal power that felt genuinely anointed. She belonged fully to that world, or so the church assumed. The problem was that Wynona Carr heard music that existed outside the church walls, and she was not willing to pretend otherwise. When she made the move into rhythm and blues in the early 1950s, recording secular material for Specialty Records, the same label that housed Little Richard, the gospel establishment treated it as a betrayal. The crossing of that line was not just commercial. In those circles, it was spiritual desertion. The church that had celebrated her stopped booking her. Her gospel connections dried up with remarkable speed. What made the band so complete was how quietly it operated. There was no formal announcement. Doors simply closed, and the community moved on to the next voice, while Wynona Carr was left to build her career in a world the church had told her was sinful. She never recaptured the momentum she had in gospel, and the secular world she moved into never fully embraced her either. Wynona Carr fell through the gap between two worlds, quietly banned by the church, quietly banned by the channel title she helped build. Before moving ahead, take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next story. 19. Della Reese. Della Reese came up inside the church with a voice that turned heads from the moment she opened her mouth. She sang with Mahalia Jackson as a teenager, which in gospel circles was about as strong an endorsement as any young singer could receive. The church knew her. The church loved her. And then she left, and the church never quite forgave her for it. When Della Reese crossed into jazz and pop in the late 1950s, recording mainstream material and building a career far outside the gospel world, the community she came from applied the kind of quiet pressure it had perfected. She was not denounced from pulpits. She was simply excluded from the ecosystem that had trained her. The gospel world has a long memory for what it considers defection, and Reese's pivot to secular music was filed under exactly that label. The distance between Della Reese and the church widened over decades as her entertainment career took her through nightclubs, variety television, and eventually acting. Her gospel roots were acknowledged by critics and historians, but rarely by the institutions that felt she had abandoned a sacred calling for a commercial one. The church that laid her foundation quietly removed her name from the conversation. Years later, she became ordained as a minister and founded her own spiritual community, a full-circle moment that the church's earlier verdict had made harder and more complicated than it ever needed to be. Among gospel legends the church quietly banned, her story carries the particular sting of rejection from a world that had once called her gifted. 18. Billy Preston. Billy Preston grew up inside the church, learning to play gospel piano with a facility that amazed everyone who heard him. He was performing with gospel groups by the time he was a teenager, sharing stages with artists like Mahalia Jackson, and absorbing the emotional language of sacred music in ways that would shape everything he played for the rest of his life. The church was his training ground, his community, and his first audience. But Billy Preston moved. He crossed into rhythm and blues, then into rock, eventually collaborating with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones in ways that put his gospel roots inside a context the church found deeply uncomfortable. His sexuality, which he never loudly announced, but also never concealed within the circles he moved in, added another layer of tension between him and the religious world that had formed him. Gospel institutions that celebrate anointing rarely extend that same celebration to artists whose lives complicate the church's preferred narrative. Preston was not formally expelled from gospel. He was quietly removed from consideration. Radio stations rooted in religious broadcasting did not play his records. Churches did not invite him back as a guest artist. The line between the church's gospel world and the mainstream world Billy Preston inhabited became a wall, built without a single public statement being made about it. He died in 2006, having never received the sustained gospel recognition that his roots and his talent warranted. Among the 20 gospel legends the church quietly banned, Billy Preston stands as one of the clearest examples of what the institution loses when it chooses image over artistry. 17. Jennifer Holliday. Jennifer Holliday came from the black church and never pretended otherwise. Her voice, enormous and saturated with gospel feeling, announced exactly where it had been formed before she ever explained it in an interview. She carried that church Dina into Broadway and into the mainstream, delivering performances of staggering emotional force that owed everything to the sanctuary tradition she grew up inside. The church should have been proud. Instead, it grew cautious when Jennifer Holliday began speaking openly about her personal struggles, including deeply personal accounts of depression, health challenges, and her identity. The gospel community that might have claimed her began its familiar retreat. She also made public statements about her sexuality that, in the specific culture of black gospel, carry an institutional price that no amount of vocal talent can fully offset. The church does not hold formal votes on who is acceptable. It simply stops reaching out. The bookings from gospel events thinned. The invitations to minister in music at church-affiliated events became less frequent. Her mainstream career continued, but the specific community her voice most naturally belonged to had decided quietly that Jennifer Holliday was a complicated figure. And complicated figures require a kind of public management the church has historically chosen to avoid by simply not mentioning the person at all. She represents something gospel music has never resolved cleanly: what to do with the enormous voices it produces when those voices belong to people whose full lives do not match the institution's preferred image of its own artists. 16. Clara Ward. Clara Ward was one of the most celebrated gospel performers of the 20th century, leading the famous Ward singers through a run of performances and recordings that made her name synonymous with the golden era of the genre. Aretha Franklin cited her as a defining influence. Audiences packed auditoriums to see her perform. Inside the gospel establishment, she was royalty. And then she began performing in Las Vegas, and the establishment decided royalty had limits. When Clara Ward took the Ward singers into nightclub venues and Las Vegas residencies in the 1960s, performing gospel music in spaces the church considered profane, the reaction from the gospel world was immediate and pointed. The same community that had celebrated her as a carrier of sacred tradition began treating her as someone who had commercialized and degraded it. The fact that she was bringing gospel to audiences who would never set foot in a church was not considered a ministry argument. It was considered an offense. The church quietly withdrew its full embrace of Ward, and the gospel industry followed. She remained famous, but increasingly outside the inner circle of an institution that had once built itself partly around her name. Among 20 gospel legends the church quietly banned, Clara Ward's case carries a specific irony. The woman who helped Aretha Franklin find her voice was told her own voice was no longer welcome in the spaces it helped define. She continued performing until her health failed, dying in 1973. The church's quiet verdict never officially changed, even as history recognized what it had failed to protect while she was still alive. If these stories are surprising you, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what we uncover next. 15. Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia Jackson is remembered today as gospel's greatest voice, a singer whose performances at civil rights events placed her beside Martin Luther King and whose recordings crossed every border gospel had ever respected. She is treated now as the institution saint. What gets discussed less is that Mahalia Jackson spent meaningful portions of her career in genuine tension with the church establishments that are most loudly associated with her legacy, precisely because she refused to operate inside their preferred boundaries. Her decision to perform on secular stages and to record for mainstream labels made segments of the gospel world deeply uncomfortable. She navigated that tension carefully throughout her career, never fully crossing into secular music, but never allowing the church's gatekeepers to fully control her either. When she sang at Carnegie Hall and appeared on mainstream television programs, voices inside the gospel community questioned whether she was representing the music properly or simply chasing fame. The tension was quieter in her case than in others on this list, because Mahalia Jackson's stature made open criticism dangerous. But the institutional discomfort with her independence, her insistence on controlling her own career, and her willingness to take gospel into spaces the church had not approved was real and documented by those who knew the industry well. Among the gospel legends the church quietly banned from full institutional embrace, Mahalia Jackson's story is the most complicated, because the institution now claims her completely while having spent years being uncertain about what to do with her. 14. The Clark Sisters. The Clark Sisters are among the most influential gospel groups in the history of the genre, responsible for a body of work that shaped contemporary gospel's entire sound and whose influence reaches into every corner of modern black church music. They produced recordings that generations of artists have cited as formative. They also spent years being criticized, restricted, and quietly pushed back against by the very institutions whose worship style they had revolutionized. When the Clark Sisters began incorporating rhythm and blues rhythms and contemporary production styles into their gospel recordings in the 1970s and 80s, the traditional gospel establishment reacted with genuine hostility. Their music was called worldly. Their stage presence was criticized. Churches that were actively using the emotional vocabulary the Clarks had pioneered simultaneously declined to celebrate them as innovators. The institution benefited from their contribution while quietly keeping them at arm's length. Their personal lives added additional layers of institutional discomfort over the years. Among 20 gospel legends the church quietly banned, the Clark Sisters occupy a specific and revealing position because they were simultaneously too important to ignore and too complicated for the establishment to fully embrace without reservation. The church absorbed their sound while maintaining a careful, unspoken distance from the people who created it. History has caught up with what the Clark Sisters built. The institution has found ways to celebrate them in recent years that it did not extend during the decades when the rejection was most active and most costly to their careers. 13. Andrew Crouch. Andrew Crouch changed gospel music permanently. His songwriting brought gospel into the contemporary era. His arrangements influenced every major gospel artist who came after him, and his willingness to collaborate with secular pop artists placed gospel music in contexts it had never previously reached. Michael Jackson recorded with him. Madonna drew on his influence. The mainstream music world recognized what Andrew Crouch had built, and that recognition was precisely part of the problem. The gospel establishment grew increasingly uneasy as Crouch's career moved him closer to the mainstream music world, and his questions about his personal life circulated through the industry. Rumors about his sexuality were never confirmed publicly by Crouch himself during his lifetime, but they shaped how certain segments of the gospel community related to him for years. The institution does not need confirmed facts to quietly adjust its relationship with an artist. It only needs the discomfort that rumors create. Crouch also faced criticism from traditionalists for the direction his musical innovations were taking gospel. Every step that brought the genre forward was simultaneously read by some in the establishment as a step away from what gospel was supposed to be. He spent portions of his career navigating that tension carefully, receiving industry recognition, while feeling the institutional distance that came with being too modern, too connected to the secular world, and too complicated as a person. Andrew Crouch died in 2015, having shaped gospel more profoundly than almost anyone in the post-war era. The church eventually found the language to celebrate him, but the quiet banning while he lived was real enough. 12. Dorothy Love Coates. Dorothy Love Coates was one of the most fiercely original voices gospel has ever produced, a songwriter and performer whose intensity and directness made her simultaneously one of the genre's most celebrated and most uncomfortable figures. She wrote songs that were honest about suffering, about injustice, and about the gap between what the church promised and what life actually delivered. That kind of honesty was not always welcome inside the institutions that preferred their gospel clean and uncomplicated. Her refusal to soften her message, to perform with the kind of joyful removal from hardship that many gospel gatekeepers preferred, put her at odds with certain segments of the establishment throughout her career. She engaged openly with civil rights politics in ways that made some churches nervous about booking her. She was the kind of artist whose truth-telling made audiences feel things the church was not always prepared to process in a single Sunday morning service. The banning in Coates' case was never total. She was too respected as a vocalist and too embedded in the tradition for the church to simply exclude her. But the institutional discomfort with her directness shaped her bookings, her recognition, and the degree to which the gospel establishment championed her work. Among gospel legends the church quietly banned from full celebration, she represents the artists punished simply for telling the truth too plainly. Dorothy Love Coates died in 2002. Gospel history remembers her as a legend. The institution that made her life harder than it needed to be has been considerably quieter about acknowledging its role in doing so. Drop a comment and tell us which of these stories hit you hardest. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. 11. James Cleveland. James Cleveland was called the King of Gospel, and the title was not an exaggeration. He shaped the sound of the modern gospel choir more completely than any other individual in the history of the genre. His arrangements, his recordings, and his Gospel Music Workshop of America transformed how gospel was organized, produced, and distributed across American churches. He was the institution's most powerful figure for decades. He was also the institution's most carefully managed secret. Rumors about James Cleveland's sexuality circulated within the gospel world for years, known quietly by industry insiders and church leadership who chose to maintain the silence that protected the institution's most valuable commercial asset. His death in 1991 from AIDS-related illness brought those questions into the open, but even then the gospel establishment worked carefully to manage the narrative around his passing. The man who built more of gospel's infrastructure than anyone was protected while he lived and managed carefully after he died. The quiet banning of James Cleveland was different from others on this list. He was never excluded from the industry he built. He was excluded from honesty. The institution kept him central while keeping his full story peripheral, which is its own form of erasure. His legacy was celebrated. His humanity was quietly edited. Among 20 gospel legends the church quietly banned, Cleveland's case is the most institutionally revealing because it shows that the church will protect its most powerful figures from accountability while simultaneously denying them the basic dignity of being fully known. 10. Walter Hawkins. Walter Hawkins helped create the sound of modern gospel with a warmth and musical sophistication that made his recordings feel like prayer. His Love Alive albums became some of the most celebrated in gospel history, blending soul and sacred music in ways that felt genuinely new. He was a pastor, a composer, and a voice that the church claimed proudly. He was also a man whose full life the church spent considerable energy managing carefully once certain truths became harder to contain. Walter Hawkins lived as a gay man, a truth that became more openly discussed later in his life and after his death in 2010. During the years when his ministry was most active and his recordings were most widely celebrated, the gospel establishment maintained the specific silence it reserves for its most beloved and most complicated figures. The institution does not formally ban artists whose commercial and cultural value is this high. It simply ensures that the full story remains in the margins. His marriage to Tremaine Hawkins, also a celebrated gospel artist, added further layers of complexity to a story the church preferred not to examine too closely. The two eventually divorced after years of gospel ministry together. The church that benefited from their combined contribution found it much easier to celebrate their music than to sit honestly with the full context of their lives. Walter Hawkins belongs on the list of gospel legends the church quietly banned not because he was removed from gospel, but because the institution removed his truth from the conversation while keeping his voice at the center of it. 9. Al Green. Al Green is one of the most extraordinary voices American music has ever produced. He crossed between gospel and soul with a fluidity that made the boundary between sacred and secular feel almost irrelevant, and his recordings from the early 1970s remain some of the most emotionally powerful in either genre. When he walked away from secular music in the late 1970s and became a fully ordained minister, many in the gospel world embraced what they read as a return to righteousness. But the relationship between Al Green and gospel institutions was never as simple as a prodigal son coming home. The circumstances of his departure from secular music, specifically the traumatic incident in 1974 when a woman he had been involved with attacked him and then took her own life, were handled by the church with a combination of spiritual framing and institutional silence. The full human complexity of what Al Green experienced and the circumstances that surrounded it were reduced to a conversion testimony that served the church's preferred narrative of redemption without fully grappling with the actual story. When Green's gospel recordings did not achieve the commercial scale the industry wanted, the enthusiasm from certain corners of the gospel establishment cooled in ways that revealed how much of the welcome had been about potential rather than genuine ministry partnership. The church quietly reduced its investment in his gospel career while maintaining the public language of celebration around his conversion. Al Green built one of gospel music's great late-career ministries largely on his own terms, having learned early that the institution's embrace came with conditions he was never fully consulted about. 8. Ray Charles. Ray Charles grew up in the church and carried its music inside him for the entirety of his career. His early gospel training shaped the way he approached every note he ever sang, and musicians who worked with him for decades described the sacred feeling that lived underneath even his most secular recordings. The church made Ray Charles's art possible. The church also decided, early and emphatically, that Ray Charles had no place within its walls once he began recording rhythm and blues. His transformation of gospel musical vocabulary into secular emotional expression was treated by the gospel establishment as theft and profanity simultaneously. He was called a sinner for taking the sounds of worship into nightclubs and dance halls. Churches that had celebrated the tradition he drew from refused to claim him as a product of that tradition. The banning was cultural and categorical rather than personal. Ray Charles had committed the specific sin of making people feel in a secular context what they were supposed to feel only in church. The gospel world's rejection of Ray Charles did not slow him down commercially. He built one of the most celebrated careers in American music history without the institution's blessing. But it shaped the conversation around his gospel roots in ways that persisted for decades, with church circles being among the last to formally acknowledge what he had taken from them and what he had given back through the art he made. Among gospel legends the church quietly banned, Ray Charles stands as the most commercially vindicated. The institution that rejected him spent the following decades watching the world recognize exactly what it had tried to push away. 7. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye's father was a Pentecostal minister, and Marvin Gaye grew up inside a church household where the sacred was not a weekly event, but the entire organizing structure of daily life. He sang in church, he absorbed the emotional intensity of gospel music, and he carried that intensity into a secular career that became one of the defining artistic stories of the 20th century. The church that produced him never fully claimed him, and the family church environment he grew up in contributed directly to the psychological damage that shaped his most troubled years. His shift from Motown soul into the socially conscious, sexually frank music of What's Going On and Let's Get It On placed him in explicit conflict with the religious tradition his upbringing represented. Gospel institutions that might have pointed to his roots as evidence of the church's cultural reach instead treated him as a cautionary example of what happens when talented young men leave the path. The fact that his own father was a minister who inflicted serious psychological harm on him throughout his life was not something the church chose to examine publicly. Marvin Gaye attempted several gospel-inflected projects and maintained a complex and ambivalent relationship with faith for the entirety of his career. The gospel establishment met that ambivalence with its own. His genius was acknowledged, his gospel roots were mentioned when useful, and the full story of what the church environment of his childhood had done to him was carefully left outside the frame of any institutional celebration. He was shot and killed by his father in 1984. The church that shaped both men had very little public accounting to offer for either of them. 6. Little Richard. Little Richard Penniman came from the church. He sang gospel as a child, he returned to gospel multiple times across his career, and the sound he brought to rock and roll was essentially church music with the volume and the inhibition both turned up simultaneously. He was one of the most explosive performers American music had ever seen, and the source of that explosion was the Black Pentecostal church tradition he had grown up inside. The church made Little Richard. The church also spent decades refusing to fully accept him back. His sexuality was known within the circles he moved in from early in his career, and the gospel establishment responded with the silence and exclusion it applied to all artists whose personal lives conflicted with its public theology. When he periodically renounced rock and roll and returned to gospel recording and preaching, the church welcomed the performance of repentance while maintaining a careful institutional distance from the person performing it. His returns were treated as events rather than as genuine reintegrations. Little Richard oscillated between secular performance and gospel ministry multiple times across his career, each oscillation reflecting both his genuine spiritual complexity and the impossibility of the choice the church demanded of him. He could be rock and roll, or he could be gospel. He could not be a full human being whose life contained both, because the institution that held gospel did not have room for that particular truth. He died in 2020, celebrated by the secular world as a foundational genius and claimed cautiously and selectively by the gospel world that had formed him. Among gospel legends the church quietly banned, Little Richard's story is the one that most clearly reveals the cost of the institution's demand for impossible purity. 5. Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin is the greatest vocalist in American music history by almost any measure applied to the question. She is also a figure whose relationship with the Black church was far more complicated and contested than the institution's current celebration of her legacy would suggest. Her father was Reverend C.L. Franklin, one of the most powerful ministers in the country, and she was raised inside a gospel world of considerable influence. That world watched her leave, and it did not simply wait patiently for her to return. When Aretha Franklin moved to Columbia Records as a teenager and then to Atlantic to build the secular soul career that made her a global star, the gospel establishment applied the same judgment it applied to every artist who crossed that line. She was treated as someone who had traded sacred calling for commercial ambition. The fact that her recordings carried more raw gospel feeling than most of what was being produced inside the church at the time was not considered an adequate defense by the gatekeepers who had decided she had defected. She maintained her church connection throughout her career in ways other artists on this list did not, returning to gospel recording and performance periodically and maintaining genuine relationships with church leadership. But the institutional discomfort with the fullness of her secular career and with certain elements of her personal life meant that the church's embrace of Aretha Franklin was always calibrated rather than complete. Among gospel legends the church quietly banned from full institutional celebration, she is the most complicated case because the church's current posthumous canonization of her has largely erased the tension that defined their actual relationship. The institution that once questioned whether she belonged is now the loudest voice, claiming her as its own. That transformation says more about the church than it does about Aretha Franklin. 4. Thomas A. Dorsey. Thomas A. Dorsey is now called the father of gospel music, a title the church bestows with complete institutional confidence. What the church discusses far less is that Thomas Dorsey spent years being banned from the very churches whose music he was simultaneously inventing. He was the artist who brought blues feeling into sacred music, who insisted that the sound of black suffering and black joy belonged inside the sanctuary, and the establishment responded by closing its doors to him before it eventually had no choice but to accept what he had built. In the 1920s and early 30s, Dorsey's gospel compositions were rejected by churches across Chicago that found his blues-inflected arrangements too worldly, too close to the devil's music to be permitted inside their walls. He was turned away from church after church as he tried to introduce a musical style that would eventually become the foundation of the entire genre. The banning of Thomas Dorsey by the church is perhaps the most historically significant case on this list, because the institution banned the man who was in the process of creating the very music it would later claim as its defining tradition. He eventually forced his way in through persistence, talent, and the undeniable emotional power of what he had written. Songs like Precious Lord Take My Hand, composed after the death of his wife and infant son, were so clearly sacred in their emotional honesty that even the most resistant churches could not maintain their objections. But the years of rejection were real, and the irony of the father of gospel being banned by the church he fathered is one the institution rarely volunteers to discuss. Among 20 gospel legends the church quietly banned, Thomas Dorsey's case is the most revealing about the institution's relationship with its own history. The church banned its founder, adopted his creation, and spent the following decades pretending the banning never happened. 3. Tonex. Tonex was one of the most gifted and innovative artists gospel music produced in the post-Kirk Franklin era. His vocal range, his production instincts, and his willingness to take gospel music into new sonic territory made him a genuinely thrilling figure in a genre that needed exactly what he brought to it. He won awards, built a dedicated following, and earned the respect of musicians who recognized the level of talent he possessed. And then he sat down for an interview in 2009 and told the truth about his sexuality, and the gospel world responded as though he had ceased to exist. The speed and completeness of the gospel establishment's rejection of Tonex after he came out as gay was striking even by the standards of an industry with a documented history of this kind of response. Radio stations stopped playing his music. Booking agencies removed him from their rosters. Church platforms that had previously celebrated him closed without explanation or ceremony. He rebranded himself as B. Slade and moved into secular music, which was less a career pivot than it was a response to having had his gospel career surgically removed from underneath him. What made the Tonex case particularly painful was how little space the gospel community created for any honest conversation about what it had done. The banning was swift, comprehensive, and followed by a silence that suggested the industry preferred to behave as though he had simply never existed. Among 20 gospel legends the church quietly banned, Tonex represents the most recent and clearest example of the institution's capacity for organized erasure when an artist's truth challenges its theological comfort. He built a new career outside gospel and has spoken honestly about the cost of the rejection. The gospel industry has not publicly offered anything resembling accountability for what it did to one of its most genuinely gifted voices. 2. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke was the most transcendent gospel voice of his generation, the lead singer of the Soul Stirrers, and a figure whose performances inside the gospel world were described by those who witnessed them as genuinely otherworldly. When he performed gospel, audiences wept. Ministers who watched him cited his voice as evidence of divine presence. He was the peak of what gospel performance could be, and he was banned from that world in one of the most dramatic and public rejections the genre has ever produced. When Sam Cooke released You Send Me in 1957 under his own name after recording a trial secular single under the pseudonym Dale Cook, the Soul Stirrers fired him. The gospel establishment treated his crossover as an act of apostasy. Audiences that had worshipped his voice in church yelled, "Get that blues singer off the stage," when he attempted to return for Soul Stirrers performances. The community that had built him around him dismantled its relationship with him with a speed and totality that shocked even those who knew the industry's capacity for exclusion. The banning of Sam Cooke from the gospel world produced one of the greatest secular music careers in American history. The soul and pop recordings he made between 1957 and his death in 1964 changed American music permanently. But they came at the direct cost of his gospel community, which refused to reclaim him and which maintained its rejection for the remainder of his shortened life. Among gospel legends the church quietly banned, Sam Cooke's case is the most dramatic in its consequences because the institution lost the greatest voice it had ever produced and replaced the loss with silence. He was shot and killed under circumstances that remain disputed in December 1964. The gospel world that had banned him mourned quietly and without acknowledging what the rejection had cost both of them. 1. Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Sister Rosetta Tharpe invented more of what we call rock and roll than almost any other single figure in American music history. She played electric guitar with distortion and power before anyone had established rules about who was supposed to do that. She performed with showmanship and physical energy that made audiences feel things their bodies were not prepared for. She blended gospel and blues and jazz in ways that created an entirely new sound. And she did all of this while being systematically shunned by the church she had grown up inside, the church whose music she was simultaneously transforming into something the world would never stop hearing. When Tharpe began performing gospel music in nightclubs, on secular stages, and alongside swing bands and jazz orchestras in the late 1930s, the gospel establishment treated it as the worst kind of desecration. A black woman playing electric guitar in a nightclub while singing about God was, to the conservative religious institutions of that era, an offense against every category they had constructed around gender, genre, and sacred space. Churches that had celebrated her as a child prodigy withdrew their embrace. The community that had formed her decided she had gone somewhere it could not follow. She was contractually trapped between worlds for years, unable to fully return to gospel because of secular recording commitments, unable to be fully accepted by the secular world because of her gospel identity. The church quietly banned her from the institutional recognition that her talent and her historical significance warranted, and that ban shaped how she was remembered for decades after her death. The artists she influenced directly, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Johnny Cash, were inducted into halls of fame and celebrated as foundational. Tharpe herself was largely forgotten. Sister Rosetta Tharpe sits at number 1 among gospel legends the church quietly banned because her case produced the greatest historical injustice. She gave the world its most influential music, the church gave her its silence, and it took generations for the record to begin being corrected. 20 names. 20 stories, and in almost every case, the same pattern. An artist with genuine gifts builds something real inside gospel music, encounters a line the institution has drawn quietly and without public announcement, and finds themselves on the outside of a community that will never formally explain why it stopped calling. The church rarely bans anyone out loud. It simply stops making room. The silence is the ban, and it has cost gospel music more talent, more truth, and more human dignity than the institution has ever been willing to publicly account for. Which of these 20 stories surprised you the most, and which one do you think the gospel world owes the longest overdue apology? Drop your answer in the comments below. If these stories matter to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are more untold stories from inside gospel music coming, and you do not want to miss a single one.